welcome everyone. As many of you know, we've been running a Global Insight Roundtable Series. This is Roundtable number 5. So really very excited about this topic. Really at the forefront, I think, of risk and compliance. Really talking about some of the nuanced issues that we're seeing surface in the landscape. I'm Paula Fontana. I'm joined here by Dan Shields. Dan, you want to take a couple minutes to introduce yourself?
Thanks very much, Paula, and good to see everybody. There's definitely some familiar faces in the audience there, so hi to all of you. For those that I don't know, so I was the co-founder with Josh of RiskLogic back in 2005, and he and I led that organisation for a very long time. I was also involved in the startup of Catalyst Technologies, which obviously is iluminr. So very familiar with the organisation and with the product set and with the journey. These days, I'm involved in a startup called Sention, and what we do is look at the corporate threat intelligence landscape. If you think about a crystal ball, our job is to pull that crystal ball out and forecast emerging risk and how that could impact other organisations. Everything from the geopolitical situation to cyber risk to health, security, natural disasters, of course, technology, government, economics. So we look at all the different types of events that could be emerging that could create harm to businesses and help them understand what that looks like and what they can do about that. So ESG is obviously the topic for today, but that's one of a number of very significant challenges that we're facing going forward. So we've certainly immersed ourselves in that in terms of not just the challenges, but also the opportunities for organisations. So great to be here. Thanks, Paula.
I'm excited to have you here. I feel like I've known you for so long, and I know we just recently met. So but before we jump in with Dan, I want to invite everybody to participate in a poll. How prepared is your organization to respond to compliance challenges related to climate risk and sustainability? Dan, how do you anticipate people would answer this question?
I think that we'll see somewhere between the somewhat unprepared and not prepared for a large majority of organisations. So I haven't worked with the audience we have here today, but that is certainly my experience. It's great to see organisations that are prepared, and that's always nice to see there. But by and large, there's still a bit of a gap there we see.
Now, from your perspective, what's the monster in the cupboard that people should be thinking about, or teams should be thinking about with regard to sustainability and climate risk?
Look, it's an interesting question because climate is really going to underpin everything we do going forward. I've had discussions with lots of people about the challenges around cyber, and cyber is the #1 risk for most organisations, and it is in the short to medium term. But if we look at the longer term horizon, climate really is going to underpin everything. How we operate our businesses, the choices that customers make, the investment decisions that get made, everything that connects with that. We, in a more immediate sense, we're already seeing the impacts of severe weather events in organisations, particularly on business operations. Now, I know we'll have quite a few people from Australia here, and maybe some people from offshore. But here in Australia, over the last few years, we've had enormous impacts on things like supply chain, from flooding, from bushfires, from severe weather events taking place. So we're seeing that right here and now. And even when it comes to finance, Commonwealth Banks, and that's our largest bank here in Australia, came out only in the last 2 weeks when they released their annual results to say that they will no longer lend to organisations in the fossil fuel industry unless they have effective climate transition plans in place. Now, what is an effective climate transition plan? Well, that's anybody's guess at this stage, but that's an indication, really, of just how climate risk sustainability really is going to be a driving factor for so much that takes place. But back to your question, what is the monster in the room? Well, right now, the monster in the room really is mandatory disclosure. In Europe and other parts of the world, they're probably ahead of Australia in terms of mandatory reporting around climate. and sustainability. But Australia has introduced mandatory disclosure laws. Some of you may be very familiar with those and pulling your hair out over them. Others may not have actually embraced that because you're not eligible to comply yet. But mandatory disclosure is a big challenge for organisations. The laws were supposed to come into effect on the 1st of July. It was widely known that corporate Australia was not ready for that, and they've been pushed back to the beginning of next year. So there's a transitional period. Not every organisation has to comply and start to report straight away. The biggest ones do, then the next tier of organisations and so on. But it's not just being able to report your direct and indirect climate exposures, but you also have to report the climate impacts in your value chain and your supply chain. And the big challenge with that is that it's not just those reporting entities that are captured, but it's anybody that forms part of an organisation's value chain that will also have to start identifying their climate impact. So it's a massive capture in terms of who needs to be involved here. A lot of indirect challenges for smaller organisations that form part of that supply chain for a reporting entity. So mandatory climate disclosures is the big one right now facing organisations in Australia. That's the one that's going to occupy a lot of headspace, a lot of time and energy in terms of what to report it, how to capture it.
I know there's been a fair degree of change and ambiguity around the requirements, specifically around reporting expectations, what constitutes good. I think even public perception has shifted quite a bit, even in the last year, around things like climate change. When we have this level of uncertainty, do you feel like that slows decision-making around climate down, or do you feel like most organizations are on top of it?
Look, I don't think it's necessarily slowing decision-making down because I think a lot of organisations are actually not necessarily factoring in climate risk and sustainability yet into that level of decision-making. In fact, we still see a lot of organisations being in reactive mode. So when something occurs, they'll then deal with it, respond to it, and so on. And of course, those organisations that are more proactive are looking forward. Then what they're doing is that it's changing how they make decisions rather than necessarily slowing it down. So they're very much factoring in different considerations around consumer patterns and preferences and expectations. They're looking at different data sets. They're using different sets of information in terms of how to assess resilience and operations, to evaluate supply chains. So I just think it's a different type of decision making where there is awareness and understanding as opposed to necessarily slowing it down. For those that aren't embracing it or aren't prepared or put their head in the sand because it's too hard, I just think that it's put aside there. But looking at the poll here today, with 6 that are moderately prepared but with some gaps, is actually a really good result. I think that's good to see. Probably the big question is, what does moderately prepared actually mean in the context of going forward versus somewhat unprepared versus not prepared at all? I think that's a little bit of a hard one for people to understand at the moment. What are we actually rating ourselves against?
Yeah. Now, when boards and executive teams are looking at the trade-offs between ESG commitments or climate commitments and financials, what does that look like?
Look, I think that when it comes to boards and executive teams, if we wind the clock back a few years ago, everybody was going, look, ESG, we have to embrace ESG. Let's set up a program, and I think it's evolved a little bit since then. Climate risk now is probably the top of the list under this banner of ESG. And climate risk really is quite a complicated set of considerations. Whereas what I certainly saw a lot of is, how are we going to reduce our footprint in the office, for example? We use less paper, change the way some of our practices. What are we going to tell our consumers in the market about our ESG credentials? So in a sense, it was really a combination of marketing activities and feel-good activities. That was a few years ago. And of course, today, there is some very concrete requirements, considerations. If we don't get those right, then they have very significant implications to our organisation. So I do think at the boardroom level now, there is starting to be an appreciation, firstly, of well, what does this actually mean for us? We may not have the answers, but we're starting to understand that there are, we need to start looking at this. There is, at the boardroom level, again, under the Corporations Act, a specific requirement for directors to start to understand what these things look like, what climate risk looks like, what the impact to the organisation is going to be. So it's no longer a nice to have, but there's a legal obligation and a corporate governance obligation on boards to actually start to assess this kind of thing and start to consider it in their decision making.
And this particular poll question, so there's a new poll question for those of you who are following along. Which of the following do you see as the most significant compliance risk when navigating the transition to sustainable practices? And we have inadequate climate risk reporting, failure to meet evolving regulatory standards, greenwashing leading to legal repercussions, and misalignment between ESG goals and operational practices. So, but I think what's not up here is, an aspect that you just referenced in terms of understanding, I guess it's related to this first column here, inadequate climate risk reporting and even ascertaining, based on what we're seeing even emerge in the world today, what are the ramifications to business operations? How do you find companies grappling with some of those questions?
I think when it comes to business operations, that's one where I guess that falls back into the area of business continuity and core resilience. We've always, when we build business continuity programs, we've always looked at disruption to supply chains, loss of access to site, those considerations. I think the challenge today is these events are happening more frequently and they're more severe and they're compounding on each other. So it's not just a severe weather event, but it's that happening when you've got a cost of living crisis. And here in Australia, for example, challenges from the construction industry. So, if there is a disruption, if there's damage to infrastructure, damage to road systems, that then disrupts a supply chain. These things are taking much longer to repair and fix. And you've already got other issues you're grappling with at the moment as well. Even when we come to cyber, for example, the cyber risk is changing significantly and organisations are investing in that and dealing with that at the same time trying to deal with operational disruption and supply chain. Take the geopolitical situation at the moment. That is creating marine supply chain challenges with shipping through the Red Sea and the Panama Canal, and that's increased shipping costs and timeframes. Add that into a natural disaster that then causes a supply chain disruption. You can see then we start to have a real amplification of the impacts back to organisations around time, cost, continuity of operations, meeting customer demands and expectations. So I think the physical aspect of climate risk is really visible now, and that compounding effect of other events is really coming to the fore in terms of what that means. Here in Australia, we're about to go into summer again, hopefully soon, get rid of this cold weather. But spring's about to start, which will be lovely. But we go into our fire season and our storm season. And, we actually don't know what that looks like because past experience and records don't really mean much today because everything's kind of breaking the rules in terms of that. So that's really important there, I think, in terms of risks. And of course, that then extends back into things like what we have here, inadequate climate risk reporting. We actually need to understand our impacts on the climate and on the environment. How do we do that? How do we measure it? Do we have the resources available to be able to actually start to conduct this kind of analysis and reporting? That's really hard for organisations today. And when you've got pressure on budgets, like a lot of organisations do, given the economic situation, where do those resources come from? And that then translates into the other compliance risks that we have here, such as misalignment between ESG goals and operational practices, failure to meet evolving regulatory standards. These things are all connected together.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that's been interesting to follow, especially as insurers have looked at pulling back in some climate sensitive areas, such as here in the United States, California, Florida, are are kind of at the forefront of some of these issues around insurability. Yeah, I think one thing that stands out to me, just thinking through that, is we talk a lot about, the idea of future gazing here at iluminr, leveraging scenarios to sort of better predict how we might respond in some of these, like you say, these are novel scenarios. There is no historical, to go back to and say, well, we did X, Y, and Z. This is the playbook, right? There is no playbook in a lot of these cases. How do organizations effectively adapt when there is no blueprint?
Yeah, look, that's a really tough one because it's not just climate, but even the economic situation. When we look at that at the moment, the old rule book that economists use to predict what's going to happen next has gone out the window because no one actually really knows. We're just not playing by any of the rules. So, in all these situations, how do you manage it? Well, I think the first thing is you've got to continue to build resilience within your organisation. A lot of organisations, when supply chains were quite brittle, they were single source suppliers, had extended supply chains. Organisations didn't really understand where the vulnerabilities and the single points of failure would be within those supply chains. So that requires understanding that, really breaking it apart and looking at where the points of weakness are within an organisation. So when we look at things like, say, climate risk as an example, exactly the same thing needs to apply in that understanding where your vulnerabilities lie, what drives those vulnerabilities, building in resilience. So you've got backup, you've got redundancy in that, whether it's operations, supply chain, and other parts of the organisation. So that's one aspect to it, and that really challenges the traditional concept of the business continuity plan. I think they don't really go far enough in terms of today's environment. So I think we need to, coming back to operational resilience, we really need to understand what that looks like. And then the second part is preparation, and it comes back to exercising. We know that when you exercise, then you build in essentially muscle memory in terms of how to respond to events. You start to understand where your weaknesses are, both in terms of capability and operations. So running scenarios, running regular exercises, doing it more frequently than the once a year major exercise is key in that. And that's really getting everybody ready for these new disruptions that occur. So I think those are critical aspects. I think the third part then is being able to look forward, understanding what's coming next, and start to assess that and give yourself time to navigate your organisation around it. Those three things together, I think, will really, help. They're not going to eliminate the challenges that we face with things like climate, compliance, and sustainability, but they give us the ability to handle those more effectively and potentially reduce impact. And at the same time, then start to look at where the opportunities might lie, because it's very easy when we talk ESG and climate to get only focus on the negatives. But if we get this right, there's enormous opportunities that are out there to be had for those organisations that are able to adapt to new technologies, look at new markets, introduce new products to address some of these gaps there.
If there was one scenario that you think teams should be thinking about with regard to climate, what would that be?
Well, look, for those organisations that are going to have to get captured by mandatory reporting, one of the requirements is actually to stress test your scenarios. So it's actually something you've got to do now going forward anyway. But what is the number one? Look, I think at this point in time where we sit, it's operational disruption is what we've got to focus on. Continue to run scenarios around that, and particularly in relation to supply chain. That's where the big vulnerability still lies. We know through COVID, supply chains were decimated, and we came back from that. But we've got different challenges on supply chain today than what we had 2 or 3 years ago. And the geopolitical situation is a big driver of that. And as I mentioned earlier on, the compounding impacts of other events. So I do think that the biggest focus at the moment needs to be on shoring up supply chain, making sure operational continuity is maintained, or business continuity is maintained, and not just running the same old scenarios that have always been run, but looking at looking at from different angles. What are the different types of events that could disrupt your supply chain? It's not just going to be a severe storm event, but from a cyber perspective, or commodities that are no longer available because of a geopolitical issue or whatever it might be. So inputs, those kinds of things.
So going back to the reporting aspects of this, or I guess the governance aspects, I know we talked about this at length yesterday, because I think there is, together with kind of the assortment of emerging risks that we're seeing, I think it's posing real challenges to existing governance structures, and it's forcing those structures to become much more dynamic and agile. But that said, I know there's been a lot of talk around a lot of pressure on organizations to comply, a lot of pressure on organizations to essentially meet a specific standard. I think a lot of concerns around how organizations might be greenwashing. I think also a lot of pushback around even the principles of sustainability or ESG. Even the label ESG is somewhat political at this juncture. And where do you see organizations today, specifically in Australia and then maybe globally, with regard to some of those challenges around maybe overstating your compliance with some of these mandates, or even pressure politically, that this is just not as important as governments are making out to be.
Yeah, look, I think it's two aspects. There is the greenwashing piece, which I'll come back to in a moment, but I think firstly the political aspect. I was involved in a climate risk forum a couple of months ago, and we had some speakers who were former political leaders here in this country that now works with global climate organisations. And one of the statements that came out is around the US versus Australia in terms of what ESG actually means. And there was a very strong opinion that within the US, ESG is still being perceived as more of a marketing ploy as opposed to around climate and so on. And by that, it's that organisations are using the banner of ESG to get that gain against competitors and so on. And there is definitely what we see from this angle, a political divide between ESG/climate in the US, for and against. So I think there's some distance to go there in terms of what that looks like, a consolidated agreed view. When we look at Australia, though, there is acceptance here that it's quite different. There is agreement politically around the importance of climate risk, ESG, sustainability, governance, and what that looks like. And the mandatory reporting or disclosures is a prime example of that. That's got broad-based agreement. But I think what's driving a lot of that today for us is that we've seen the real effects of climate impact on communities and also business. Repeatedly, time after time after time over the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen enormous disruption to communities from flooding and fires, from storms. We've seen the flow-on effects to business in terms of its ability literally to move products from one part to another part of the country. And we rely so heavily on road transportation for the majority of our goods that, only a few months ago, we had major storms that disrupted the ability of trucks to move goods from the East Coast over to the West, to Western Australia, which created bare shelves in supermarkets. We have a very brittle supply chain in respect that we don't have a lot of time and a lot of stock on shelves in warehouses. So we've seen the effects of that firsthand, and I think for that reason, I don't think there's a lot of disagreement that climate risk and climate impacts are going to have a big effect. So that's the first piece. The second piece is greenwashing. Now, the question of greenwashing, in my opinion, no organisation should be worried about greenwashing because we shouldn't be getting ourselves caught up in doing greenwashing. And for those here today, if you're not clear on what greenwashing is, if you're making any form of claim around your environmental or sustainability credentials and you can't back that up and you can't demonstrate it, you can't show it, then you're at risk of greenwashing. And it's not just the statements you make about your products, it's also about your services, and it's also about your company or your business itself. Now, ASIC here in Australia has been very aggressive in terms of prosecuting or litigating against organisations for making claims that aren't substantiated. There's a number of superannuation firms that they're currently litigating against, and they've just recently won their first case against Vanguard Investments. So they're taking a tough stance. If you're deliberately out there saying things you shouldn't be saying just to gain a competitive advantage and convince customers to buy from you, then the chances are that you're going to get picked up and there's a risk of litigation today. And so no organisation should be doing that. We should be looking at ourselves saying, are we making claims? How are we making claims? What's the basis for those claims? Can we back them up? Is there anything here that is going to put us on the edge of being accused of greenwashing? And if there is, we need to change those practices immediately.
How big of an issue do you think climate transition is going to be for our organizations?
The question, well, I guess the first piece on that one is, what does climate transition actually mean? So are we all in the same, does everybody understand what it means? And we talk about net zero by 2030, and let's face it, 2030 is coming up pretty quickly. What does it actually mean? Well, look, if you take a definition, it's about transitioning from a high carbon, fossil fuel dependent economy to a low carbon sustainable. And that's one of the accepted definitions. But there's a lot of parts to what climate transition means, and it's going to mean something different for every organisation. And so there's regulatory challenges around it. So stricter, for example, carbon pricing, potentially changes to your operational model around cost, emission targets that might change, disclosure requirements, as we talked about. There's operational costs and supply chain adjustments that climate transition requires. So, how exposed are you to energy costs? If you are, then that's going to change your business model. We've talked about some of the supply chain elements already. Technology is a big part of this. And so, what infrastructure do you have today that is just not going to meet the requirements going forward? And it might not even be a governmental requirement. It could just be literally market expectations. So if you've got old, energy hungry infrastructure, that may not be acceptable in a future state. Are you looking at that today to say, how do we transition that? Are you innovating enough, but are you innovating in the right way for a future sustainable world? Do we even know what that means? Capital is a great piece at the moment. We know capital's hard to come by today in this current environment, but there are investment decisions that are very much now linked to your sustainability goals and your objectives and how you impact the environment. Even how you value assets today is also changing based on what that looks like for the future. There's reputational pieces there. If consumers believe that you are not taking sustainability and climate and the environment seriously, you're likely then to start to struggle in terms of your market expectations. Even workforce is another aspect. People are going to make decisions based on organisations that are embracing sustainability, ESG, climate. And if you're not one of those organisations, you may not actually attract the best talent in the market. We may see job displacement with people because operations are now going to have to shift and change. There's some of the challenges around climate transition. But at the same time, if you embrace these, you understand them, and you really start to challenge your organisation about how you're placed in these areas, then there is enormous opportunity to be had here. And that's why I said earlier on, we can't just focus on the risk, we have to focus on the opportunity. We manage the risk well, then we have the ability to take advantage of those opportunities that exist around new markets, increased efficiencies, more profitable organisations. So I think that's the piece that we've actually got to focus on for the future is what does our future state want to look like? Today's business model, in most cases, is probably already expired. It's outdated and outmoded. So it's really about saying, what does the future business model need to look like?
So, question for you about corporate priorities around sustainability, but also some of the other emerging threats that we're seeing really consume resource. From a prioritization perspective, from an investment perspective, cyber being one of the prominent ones, as well as AI more from an opportunity perspective. I think we're also seeing organizations, balance that with a proactive approach to managing the risks. But I think when we were preparing for the webinar, you had talked about, really the focus of prioritization at the moment, tends to be more on these imminent threats, right? Being cyber in particular for organizations, but climate, sustainability, ESG really being more the long tail concern, which I think you spoke to at kind of at the beginning of the webinar. As we move forward, and I think we're starting to see this become a more pressing issue for organizations as more organizations begin to experience impacts as you've taken us through. What does this look like in terms of executive and board level prioritization of these threats, and how do you balance this with the growth of the business?
Yeah, so look, it's an interesting question given that we still have some inflationary pressures in the market. There's still talk about a potential recession, whether it's in the US or here or elsewhere. So we know that organisations are in a different place than they were, let's say, 18 months ago. I ran a boardroom or director's lunch a few months ago on talk about ESG, and one of the really interesting discussion points that came out from board members was around how we do prioritise ESG initiatives, and that when everything's going well, it's great to invest in ESG programs, announce that to the market, put your hand up and say we're leading the four. But when budgets are tight and expenses are being cut, how do you sustain that? And that was, as I said, it was a really interesting discussion point. Ultimately, something has to give. What is that going to be? If you then start randomly cutting through or wholesale cuts to your sustainability programs, environmental initiatives, you're going to create a conflict between market expectations or stakeholder expectations and what you can deliver on, and you've got to manage that conflict. So prioritization is the key. How do you prioritize? Well, it's really about understanding what your climate risks are and your sustainability risks are. So you've got to do those climate risk assessments, and you've got to then apply those against the potential impacts to your organisation. Reputational damage. If we don't do certain things, what's the risk of damage to our brand? What are the potential compliance issues we might encounter? Now, a big one that we have monitored for a while now is the increase in litigation against companies for climate inaction. This is a prime example for boardroom considerations. Australia is actually one of the most litigated countries in the world, in fact, higher than the US when it comes to climate litigation. And what that means is that stakeholders are saying it's not good enough if firstly, you suffer an operational disruption because you didn't prepare for climate impacts. And there is risk there that you may, investor activists and so on may actually take action against your directors of your company. It's not good enough to be impacting the environment itself through your operations. And if you're not taking, specific action to minimise that, then there's litigation taking place. So that's an example of understanding where the potential risks lie in terms of your decision making around investment and how we allocate funds behind this. So ultimately, this is a strategic issue. We've got to look at it from the top down. Impact on our people, impact on our operations, impact on our brand, impact in terms of litigation, and of course, impact on our financial position. We understand that we can start to make some informed decisions around what stays, what goes, how does climate initiatives, sustainability initiatives stack up against, for example, protect ourselves against cyber risk. And all of these have to be done. We can't say we're not going to do it.
Unstable the cyber risk, right?
We can't not. I mean, look, we know cyber is changing, more sophisticated, more frequent cyber attacks. AI is playing a role in that. Cyber threat actors are changing their nature and structure. So that's not going away. Yeah. But we've got to manage that alongside some of the other challenges. And I think the thing about climate and sustainability is it's got short-term impacts, but it also has very long-term impacts as well. So understanding both of those and allocating sufficient financial resources to hit the short-term things now, but prepare for the longer-term requirements is the key.
So we've got a question from Marcus. Dan would love to hear if you've seen any consideration of ESG versus AI at the board or exco level, measuring the use and subsequent footprint of AI use, given the early signs of how resource intensive its processing power is.
Yeah, certainly. Look, in terms of actual using AI to assess that, look, it's coming. I haven't seen a direct example of that yet. Yet and it's a slight divergence. I was running another boardroom lunch recently, and we had the head of the New South Wales Real Estate Institute as part of that, and he put his hand up and said, "Look, what we're doing with AI is something really interesting. We're creating a board member that's going to be AI, and we want to assess their decision-making capabilities
Wow.
against all of our decision-making capabilities." And they've done it because it actually came out in the press a few weeks later that they gave her a name, and name's Alice something, but AI. And what they essentially did is fed this AI model all of their board papers, their inputs, and what they're running is an experiment to see how AI assesses decisions versus board members. And that can be applied in the same context for climate risk, some of the need to evaluate different priorities within the organisation. So that's an example of how it can be applied, and I certainly think it will be applied. I think it's going to be used carefully. There is a lot of opportunity around AI in terms of efficiency. Now, one thing I was on a panel for a conference last year, and we were talking about the energy transition. And my part of that was around risks associated with the energy transition. And when we look at AI, it's factoring into so many aspects of planning for new projects, new resource optimization, how we actually run our equipment and our infrastructure. So there's enormous opportunity to be had from that. I think we're still in the early stages of understanding just how powerful that can be for us, but making sure we also use it the right way as well.
Absolutely.
Good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. We've got one from Leon here. Hi, Dan, you made reference earlier on the conversation about organizations having effective sustainability goals, and what could that look like? The question is where organizations are being asked if they have sustainability goals. What are we seeing in terms of validation? What evidence or completed actions are we seeing or being challenged by either governments, regulators, insurers, and customers, if any?
Yeah, so I think I've worked with lots of organisations that do set sustainability goals. Obviously, those publicly listed companies are the ones where there is a market expectation, and they report on those within their annual reports and at their AGMs. And if they're not achieving those goals, it can have impacts on shareholder value. So they're probably the easier ones because it's visible, and they're setting those goals deliberately, with the expectation that they're going to be scrutinised against those. In terms of other organisations, as I said, I think there's a long way to go in terms of really setting appropriate and achievable sustainability goals. The mandatory disclosures, I think, will change that quite a bit because your disclosures are going to be linked to obviously how you operate your organisations, which really needs to be driven by objectives and goals there. So that, I think, will be the thing that starts to get consistency within the market around what sustainability looks like. It's being sort of driven at the moment that, in the sense that, we have to report certain things. We're trying to work out what we report and how we measure it. But once we get through that sort of initial piece, I think that will then translate into looking at from the top down, saying, well, what do we want to be measuring? What do we want to achieve here? And we're reporting on that. Just with mandatory disclosures, Group 1 entities, which are our largest organisations, are the first group to be captured. Group 2 entities will follow in 2026, and then obviously the next level down in terms of smaller organisations. So really, most organisations will capture this in some form or another.
Are there specific companies that are doing this particularly well?
Look, again, I think some of the publicly listed companies that I've worked with, particularly in the property sector, around some of the office, logistics, and retail operations, are very large providers of space. They're probably the ones I'm seeing doing the best.
Yeah.
I mean, I can.
They have to stay on top of that.
and They have very large footprints, very significant energy costs, and because they're publicly listed, again, there's expectations around share price. So for example, something the initiatives I've seen is that one of the big real estate trusts established a role at the executive level quite a few years ago now that was all about strategic initiatives to embrace the environment and sustainability. Everything from being able to convert big shopping centres to run on solar power versus the grid. We're talking massive footprints here, to embracing electric vehicles and how that works within car parks, to utilising airspace above those shopping centres more effectively, so we're not branching out. So there's a lot of different initiatives there that they were evaluating. So I've certainly seen some really good examples of that. The proof, though, is that these take time to roll out and time to generate tangible differences, and we still need to see what that looks like.
So, a question on more from a stakeholder perspective. From an investment perspective, I think we're seeing a lot of interest around understanding how boards and executive teams are navigating these issues. But I think it can be particularly challenging when you're working with a variety of external stakeholders that may or may not necessarily, to your point, have the same sort of understanding or mental model of what it is that you're trying to achieve, and some of the requirements around reporting. What sorts of things do you think stakeholders should be providing, that they aren't already?
I think this is going to underpin most investment decisions going forward as a starting point. So if you're not actually building this into your planning for that, then I think there's going to be a lot of questions asked as to why not. But in terms of what should be provided to stakeholders, look, I think if you put it under a single word, it's confidence and credibility. They're the two words I would use that we should be providing to stakeholders around our understanding of how climate, sustainability, and so on is going to affect our organisation and its impact on the environment there. If we're not doing that, then I think it raises question marks. Now, how do we provide that confidence, and how do we demonstrate credibility? Well, I think the first part of that is clearly articulating where the exposures are for the organisation. Understand your exposures. You can identify actions or controls. You can apply that not just at the operational level, but you can do it at the strategic level. That then I guess provides that that path to a sustainable organisation that's going to prosper in the future state versus one that is playing catch up or really doesn't understand what it means. So that then translates into things like, for example, the funding required and where that funding is going to go to. It affects things like people. Where are our people going to work? How are they going to work? What sort of people do we want in our organisation? It translates into things like our resilience programs. From an operational perspective, we've built redundancy and resilience into our supply chains that can cope with operational disruption caused by severe weather events or whatever. We're running continuous activities to stress test our organisation. That gives confidence to investors and stakeholders. They're the kinds of things that we need to be doing and showing to the market that will then allow us to be, to move forward and be perceived as an organisation that not only takes this seriously, but has effective plans in place to manage it.
Now, traditionally, both business impact analysis and materiality analysis have been part of the tool set that organizations have used to ascertain impact and importance to the organization. Do you see those tools evolving as we move forward, or how are organizations using those tools today?
Look, I have done probably business impact analyses in the thousands over the years, and so I'm very familiar with what they look like and how they're done, and the criteria that organisations use to assess what is critical, what's the disruption risk, and all those things. And I think the events of the last few years have largely shown us that they're not adequate in terms of being able to support an organisation through these kinds of events. I used to, quite a few years ago, I remember standing up in front of an executive team, and we were talking about events that would go beyond the scope of a business continuity plan. In other words, take it beyond what it's designed to work for. That was before the pandemic came along, and let's face it, a lot of organisations got lucky and managed to survive through it, through government funding, and in fact they had plenty of time to prepare. But there was that, and I remember saying to this particular organisation, look, if we had some global conflict, a nuclear conflict or something like that, that would of course take us well beyond the scope of a business continuity plan if that caused disruption. When we look at events happening around the world today, we have multiple events that take us well beyond the scope of what a business continuity plan is designed to traditionally deal with. So I think we've got to go much further. I think we have to get back down to the individual process level. We need to redefine what disruption risk looks like. We need to challenge and stress test these in every way possible to give us confidence it's going to work. But look, I still think business continuity planning in the traditional sense is limiting in terms of the scope and scale of events that we're dealing with today.
Do you feel that there's opportunity for the process to be much more scenario-led, like even reflecting on what we're seeing emerge in the regulatory landscape with the focus on severe but plausible scenarios?
Look, I think it has to be. Coming back to the point I made before, even with mandatory disclosures, one of the requirements is to stress test your scenarios, and that's effectively the same thing, saying, well, how is climate going to affect our organisation? And just as an aside, for those organisations that are not disclosing effectively or accurately, that is going to likely be defined as a form of greenwashing. So that's just a slight aside there. But when it comes to scenarios, look, I think we'd probably all agree, everybody that's been through a disruption, a major event that's caused impact, your best learnings have come from doing it and practicing it and experiencing it. So, if we compare running scenarios, running exercises versus paperwork and building plans, the scenarios win out every time because that's how we learn stuff. That's how we identify where the gaps and the weaknesses are. But of course, when budgets are constrained, when resources are constrained, to do the once a year major exercise, it's costly, it's time consuming, people don't have the headspace for it. So it's a limiting factor. We need to do these things more frequently, and they don't have to be big events. They can be, regular events that can just get people involved in a cadence of doing these kinds of activities.
So what is the one thing that you think this group should be thinking about now?
In terms of, we've covered off a lot of aspects today, but there's one piece that always sort of jumps out ahead of everything else for me, and it's a bit of a strategic perspective on this, and that is that I think we've got to really question ourselves as to whether our business models are still suitable for the demands of the future. We've been operating organisations in the same way for a very long time. We've come under pressure from different quarters significantly multiple times in recent years, and we've adapted, we've reacted, we've got through, we've muddled through in many cases. But it raises the question: is your business model suitable? And are the demands that are going to be placed on your organisation too much for the way your business operates today? So it comes down to understanding how well you understand what climate risk is for your organisation, being able to quantify that, and then being able to align your business strategy to it, and then saying, well, look, we have to pivot the way we operate, how we use resources, where we're located. These are all things, these are questions that need to be addressed and answered now, so you can start to prepare for the future. Climate and sustainability has immediate impacts, but it's a medium to long-term issue that you need to address today to remain competitive and take advantage of those opportunities for the future.
Paul, for a company that has been very good about engaging employees for operational, financial, and market risks, risk is everyone's responsibility. How do we adapt the culture to open into climate risk, which hasn't really hit the radar for teams outside of realty services managing energy costs?
Yeah, so how do we make this, how do we socialise across the organisation? Look, I think that the first piece is awareness. I think it's got to be communicated. So from a risk perspective, as I say, the starting point there is actually understanding climate risk. So building that into your existing risk assessments and risk management framework in an effective way. And a lot of that actually comes from external sources. So understanding emerging risk, understanding where the inputs into your organisation are from the external environment. And that's a gap that we definitely see in a lot of organisations, is getting pretty good at those internal operational risks, not so great at the external stuff coming in and the emerging risks. So that's part one, is you've got to have a story to tell. Part two then is telling that story and making it known across the business. I actually think that once you've got to that point, the climate sustainability aspect needs to be built into every business unit's objectives. It can't just be the risk department's responsibility here. It can't just be sitting at the executive level. It's got to flow through the entire organisation. So everybody has a role to play in terms of managing climate risk and sustainability, but it's not often built into the business and the personal objectives of people outside of the risk department and so on. So I do think that's a way of starting to get this understood and taken seriously across the business.
And then we have a question from Jules about who is doing this well, which I think we touched on, but I think one, I guess, point of distinction there, what separates the organizations that are doing this well versus those that are struggling?
Those that are struggling, I think, firstly, an acceptance of how important it is. That's critical. And that's got to start at the board level, flow into the executive team and then across the business. You've got, if it's led from the top down, then there's a mandate behind it. So that's definitely part of that piece. So I think that's a starting point. I think resourcing it effectively is key. Those organisations that do it well, doesn't necessarily require massive, financing of the resources, but it's who's responsible, what their role is. It's got to be clearly defined across the business as to where those sit. And then again, coming from a risk perspective, put a risk hat on, it's actually integrating climate risk into everything that gets done, the risk assessments and how that flows across the business. They're the ones that do it well. The other piece that does link into that is doing it well is one thing, but communicating it effectively is the other piece. And I think that's essential.
So as we mentioned, one key asset that a lot of organizations are using to explore climate risk to their organization, or some of these issues, broader issues around ESG or sustainability, have been scenarios. iluminr offers bite-sized scenarios that bring some of these situations to life in a very realistic way. If you are interested in bringing one of these to your team, go ahead and scan the QR code, and that'll take you to a form that you can fill out, and we'll be in touch as to how we can make that happen for you. This has been an amazing conversation, Dan. I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. I know I've learned a lot, and we hope to invite you back.
Well, thank you very much, Paula, and good to see everybody. Appreciate your time today.